Hello, I'm Dan Woog, and I'd like to welcome you tonight to this special evening. Our guest tonight is John Harris. He's the founding editor of Politico. In these days of polarized politics and siloed news sources, Politico is a must-visit news site for people of all political persuasions. With 2 decades experience at the Washington Post, John makes sure that Politico maintains the journalistic integrity of traditional newspapers while seizing all the opportunities of new media and technology streams. John has been called one of the most influential Washington journalists, and GQ named him to its list of the most influential Washington people. He's a frequent guest on Face the Nation, Washington Week, Charlie Rose, and Morning Joe. John is here thanks to Steve Parish, a longtime Westporter and friend of the library. As a crisis consultant, an advocate for corporate social responsibility, and a board member of Carleton College, the United Negro College Fund, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Tony LaRussa's Animal Rescue Foundation, and much more, Steve's Rolodex is almost as wide-ranging as John Harris's. Tonight, Steve and John will discuss 3 main topics: John's background and fascination with politics, his creation and work with Politico, and what it all means as we race toward an uncertain political future. Ladies and gentlemen, John Harris and Steve Parish.
Thank you, Dan. Good evening, everybody. And John, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This is a very special evening for us here in Westport and all the friends of the library. I'm going to apologize. I know that's not the way to start with an apology, but I apologize for my voice. The reason we're doing this online is because I've come down with COVID, and I'm feeling fine, except my voice is pretty scratchy. So thanks again, John, for being here. It's really
of course, looking forward to it very much
for us to have you. So let's get to it. As Dan sort of alluded to, your fascination with journalism and politics has come together with what is really an extraordinary career. And I'd be interested in how that interest in journalism and politics came about and when it first came together.
Sure. My interest in politics predated my interest in journalism. For whatever reason, wasn't the most common thing, I guess, at least among my friends, but I was always interested in this. I was in the 4th grade, and I was not following with any sophistication, but I was nonetheless very aware of the candidates and back and forth. In 1972, I was at that time a Nixon backer, just reflecting my family. But as I got older, I was always very interested in politics. It wasn't until I was at Carleton College that I got interested in journalism, and it seemed at the time very much sort of random, serendipity. I had a friend who was working at the college newspaper. He said, "Hey, can I assign you some stories?" I said, "Sure, I'll do it." And I had an epiphany of sorts. I just liked doing it. I liked the license that you have as a journalist to ask people questions and to probe. And I like the satisfaction of seeing my work in print and having people react to it. I enjoy writing. I take joy at the keyboard. I think I always did. So when people connect with something I write, even if it's in a contrary way, disagreement, I find it satisfying. And if they say that was really good, I find that satisfying. So although it felt like serendipity at the time, as I look back, there is a kind of a logic to it. I always thought of journalism as in a sense, a composite. In some moods, I can imagine myself on a faculty somewhere in Northfield, Minnesota, or New Haven, Connecticut, or wherever. That kind of life of ideas and life of of debate and teaching appeals to me. But that's only in some moods. I think in many moods I would find it maybe a little too removed from the action. In other moods, I've got lots of friends, some of whom we have in common, who have been involved in politics as an advisor, or I know a handful of people who pretty well as friends who ended up running for office, in addition to all the politicians I covered. That has an appeal, and yet in some ways it sort of necessarily takes you too far away from the world of ideas, and I think necessarily involves some kind of sacrifice of independence. So to me, journalism was always kind of a nice composite of different sides of my interests.
So you have your interest peaked in journalism at Carleton, and then at some point you're able to secure an internship at the Washington Post.
Well, I worked very hard. I had to do it. They told me no one year, and I came at it with kind of a battering ram the second. I was very eager to work at the Washington Post because at the time the Post had great mystique. It wasn't that long after Watergate, and so people at that time that I was reading about afar, and in some cases they later came to become good friends. Certainly were colleagues. People like Ben Bradley, the legendary editor, David Broder, the political correspondent, Mary McGrory, the columnist, Bob Woodward. They had enormous attraction to me, and the Washington Post did much more than the New York Times, because it was preeminently a political newspaper, and it was in Washington, D.C., which was where the political action was. And so I don't think the Post then, and really maybe the Post ever, has had the kind of breadth that the New York Times has, or the agenda-setting power that the New York Times had. But at that time, the Washington Post had great agenda-setting power in the arena that most interested me.
So you end up with this internship, and then a full-time job at the Post, with more than 20 years at the Post in a variety of assignments. And I want to make sure I'm right about this. It was your first major assignment Virginia politics, and you moved to Richmond?
Yeah, my first assignment was actually covering local government in the Northern Virginia suburbs. And then after a time, I moved down to Richmond. I was a state capitol correspondent at a time when somebody who's still alive, I spoke to him just the other day, Doug Wilder was the nation's first elected Black governor, highly charismatic person in the very newsy period. That was in the early 90s.
I'm curious, when you get that assignment and you're off to Richmond, what do you do to sort of get your legs under you and start the coverage? Were you replacing someone who was there who could sort of help you transition, or did you?
Yeah, that's right.
Have to make it up as you went?
This would not be true now, as the Post has retreated in ways I am disapproving of from some of its historical mandate covering the Washington region. But at the time, that mandate was very robust, and there were a couple of us down in Richmond. It's like any beat. You try to figure out who the interesting players are and what makes them tick. You find out who pretty quickly who the sort of the information traders are, who the valuable sources are, who the people that like to be in the thick of things, and you get to know them. It was not terribly challenging. The Post at that time, I guess this would still be true, but it's less consequential. But at the time, it was very consequential. Was the largest circulating newspaper in Virginia by far. So if you're the Washington Post correspondent in Richmond, you're a pretty big deal, because people are eager to get their names out. People that have ideas are eager to get their ideas out, and not a lot of venues to do it. And so it's not very hard to get doors open for you when you're at the Washington Post. in Richmond, getting actually interesting revelatory coverage is hard in any beat in any place. So, but
And so how long were you in Richmond?
I was there for 3+ years. I was there for most of the gubernatorial term, which is 4 years. And in Virginia, you're term limited. No, you don't do consecutive terms. So I was there with basically for the Wilder administration before I moved back up here to Washington and started covering national affairs.
And so what's your next job at the Post after Richmond?
I did a brief but highly satisfying period covering the U.S. military and the Department of Defense. At that time, a man who is also still living, and somebody I respect very, very much, William Parrish, was the Secretary of Defense for Bill Clinton, an extraordinarily impressive man who I'm still in touch with. He was the Secretary of Defense at that time. The issues that were the end of the Cold War, how could the American military remake itself, even as it went to a smaller structure, no longer organizing itself against the Soviet Union as an adversary, but finding that the world was still plenty complex. The crisis in the Balkans was an issue then. What would the American military commitment be to a peace settlement? Those kind of things. So I did that for a year, and then not by design, but like a lot of things by happenstance. So somebody on our White House team ended up having a child, and the White House beat's not a great beat for a young parent, and I ended up taking her job and covering Bill Clinton's presidency from the start of 1995. This was right after he had been rebuked, humiliated even in the 1994 elections with Newt Gingrich coming on. And Bill Clinton was at his low point, and I spent the next 6 years covering his presidency, including his revival from that defeat, and then some other setbacks and comebacks that were still ahead in the second term.
And so I'm going to change my lighting here in a second, but I wanted to ask you, at some point after you covered the Clinton administration, was your assignment broadened to be national politics?
I did. I took some time off and wrote a book about the Clinton presidency.
Yeah, I want to spend a few minutes on that in just a bit.
Sure.
Because it's a fascinating.
Then when I came back to that, in and around that book, I was covering national politics broadly, not just the White House. There are some people like he's a good friend of mine and a former colleague, Peter Baker at the New York Times. He's covered some of the Clinton presidency, the Bush presidency, the Obama presidency, the Trump presidency. He's organized his professional career around White House coverage. I didn't find it. I spent 6 years. That was plenty. I find the White House beat a little claustrophobic, to be honest.
And when did you get the idea to write the book about the Clinton administration?
The idea came to me, but it was I was a receptive audience. My publisher at Random House had been looking for somebody to do the sort of the first cut of history. There'll be many cuts over presumably many generations with any president, but I think Bill Clinton will sustain this kind of interest, that there'll be multiple sort of cuts that historical writers make on that subject, but they were eager for somebody to do the first. There had been books in real time, fundamentally journalistic books, even as the presidency was underway. There were starting to be some memoirs, and but there hadn't been anybody that was trying to distill and synthesize in a even as a journalist. I was aiming in that book for some historical perspective. So anyway, that was Random House. I think they were referred to me by Strobe Talbot, who had been in the Clinton administration. It wasn't somebody I knew well, but he had admired my writing and said, if you could get Harris to do that book, it would be good. They came to me, and I was enthusiastic to give it a try.
So I want to come back a little bit later to some of the things in the book, but because I want to move on to the Politico part
Sure.
of the
Please.
story. But I will say at this point that your book, which is entitled Survivor, Bill Clinton in the White House. And it, to me, is a fascinating book in that it doesn't just explain or talk about what happened, which it does talk about what happened, of course, but there is so much meat there in terms of the why and the how, and some observations that you make in the book are really, to me, very relevant to what's going on today. And once we talk a little bit more about Politico, I'd like to be able to come back to that. But at what point did you and Jim Vandehei start to think about what is now Politico?
After a long period of reporting, I had been doing it, I guess, 19 years, and had some success. There were parts of the job that I felt were getting awfully easy for me, and also getting a little bit boring. And that's not a good place to be if you're a ball player, hit the ball to me. If you're a reporter, I want that story, let me in. And if you were kind of like, go ahead and hit it somewhere else, that was not a good sign. And I did feel that about myself. Reporting is great, and I'm now, in a sense, back to reporting. I'm not in day-to-day management anymore, although I do have a significant kind of governance role at Politico. But there's something kind of for most reporters, I think there's something a little bit childlike about it. You feel like you are you're waiting for the editors to tell you you did a good job. You're waiting for the editors to tell you the story's good and you can go home. You're waiting for the editors saying, I want you to take another cut at it. You're waiting to see how many calls you can get returned, and you're desperate to get enough calls returned, and by the time deadline comes around, you think you're headed home for dinner at 6:30, and all of a sudden the evening news has something you've got to match. And I felt that it was making me feel young. I had come to the Washington Post at age 21, and I was, I guess at that time, just reaching sort of 40, and I had children, and something about it, I wanted to feel more adult. And also I had ideas about where the media business needed to go. So it was natural for me to get into to editing rather than, and it was an interesting role reversal, because when you're the editor, the other people, including people much more senior than I am with great reputations, I would be the adult and they would be the kid. And I don't want to name names, but these were like sometimes very distinguished reporters with reputations, and I could tell all of a sudden I was in the teacher role or the coach role or the parent role, and they had all the resentments and passive aggressiveness that you sometimes associate with unruly adolescent or something like that. But anyway, that deciding to become an editor at the Post led me to be really thinking about where's this business going, and in truly a case of one thing leading to another, and serendipity being more important than design in terms a lot of times in our career path, that led to Politico. I saw things that I really didn't like about what I call the old media order. And I didn't say I saw with vividness or clarity, but I had a strong intuitive sense that there were possibilities in what I was thinking of a new order of media that was there to be created. And that interested me a lot.
So what was that vision for the new order that you wanted to jumpstart, if that's the right word, with
Sure.
this new publication?
I'll answer that, but I'll talk first a little bit about what I mean by the old order. When I first got in journalism, the transition was imminent, but it hadn't happened yet, or had barely started to happen. If you were to say, well, who are the most important people in determining what Americans learn about the workings of Washington, about national politics, you could put them on a legal pad. I don't know, 3 dozen names, 4 dozen names. You would put the editors of the editor of the Washington Post, a handful of senior correspondents at the Washington Post, a handful of editors and columnists at the Washington Post. You do the exact same thing at the New York Times and the Washington bureau chief. You would, of course, do the network news anchors and their Washington bureau chiefs. At that time, seems funny to say it now, but at the time, the 3 news magazines with enormous agenda setting power, their bureau chiefs, and there you kind of have it, like those 3 dozen, 4 dozen people, incidentally at the time, still overwhelmingly white male, would have disproportionate agenda setting power. What is the rest of the country talking about? It's not direct agenda setting power, but the regional papers would tend to follow the Post and the Times, the network audiences, millions of people. And as a practical matter, the sense of what's important, what's not important, what's in bounds, what's out of bounds was done by those 4 dozen people. There was no daily conference call. There was no conspiracy. Didn't really need to be. Those people generally had similar sense of values, outlook, responsibility. But anyway, that's what I mean by the old order. It's crumbling. By the time of the internet is arriving, we see that the idea of agenda setting power itself almost became obsolete. Anyone with at that time a mouse can be her or his own editor, decide what's important. We'd see it, like the stories that would have the most traffic at the Washington Post wouldn't be the stories that the so-called establishment editors thought were important, the ones on the lead of the front page. They would be other things that for whatever reason kind of caught on with a sort of virality. And the paper itself was still organized around the way it had been organized for decades before, fundamentally around a print edition. The digital offerings were at that time. It was not that long ago, so it's pretty astonishing. As late as 2005, 2006, the web was still sort of a hassle, something, a little bit of an afterthought. And so that's crazy. It should be at the center of our thinking, at the center of our responsibilities of a journalist. How do you engage with the story? How do you engage with the audience? And wanted to see all these enormous potentialities of the digital revolution. I wanted to be able to embrace them rather than regard them defensively. And most people, what we then called legacy media, were viewing them defensively. And that seemed crazy to me. And then the other thing I would say is it was obvious, like I liked the old order, Steve. I mean, I thought it was the people who were there I admired. It was that world was attractive to me. I was doing pretty well climbing up the ladder of it, and I was sort of getting near the top of the ladder. The damn ladder crumbles on me. So the whole notion of kind of agenda setting power was gone. Well, you either can lament that, or you can kind of get with the times. And it was clear to me that there were lots of things, creative things that you could do, taking advantage of the fact that you aren't really there to narrate the world in the way that the editors of the Washington Post and the New York Times saw themselves doing in an earlier era. You were there to find interesting things, engage with the audience in different ways. And when you did, there could be enormous success. I thought there was a way to have impact and have fun. And increasingly, I was frustrated that the Post was having less and less impact, and definitely as its business model started to become challenging, less and less fun.
So the damn ladder collapses on you, and you decide you're going to create a whole new ladder.
Yeah.
And that turns out to be Politico. 15 years ago. This is the 15th anniversary, right, of
That's
the founding of Politico. What was it like in those early days? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that in the early days of Politico, it was a hard copy publication. I remember
Yeah,
going to
we
those
still have a
old,
print edition when the Congress is in session, and there's still some people who like getting their news that way.
I remember taking it out of those little boxes on the corner of 22nd and M. You know,
Yeah,
there was my
precisely.
Politico for the day.
And there's still a few of those around. It's a very small, like low single digits percentage of our revenue. When we launched, though, it was well over half of our revenue. The advertising world was still very conservative at that time, and people were gravitating toward our print edition and very slow to invest significantly in the digital buy. That was true for probably the first couple of years of our existence. We had what now looks like a very crude website. It felt, even at the time, felt a little crude. But we did it. And from the day I left the Washington Post, that was Thanksgiving of 2006, we had a website up and going, publication up and going by January 23rd. So 2 months later, it was really scary. And I teased Ben Smith, you know, he was with us at Politico. He's been with BuzzFeed and the New York Times. He's now starting this new publication, Semaphore, it's called. But they've been talking about it for the better part of a year, and I don't think they're still months away from launching.
So this past January, you got together with, as you described them, some past and present politicos to talk about the organization, its history, and sort of in light of its 15th anniversary. And you told a story in that get together about how early on somebody said to you, John, I didn't leave my job to come to work for Roll Call.
Yeah, that was the guy I just mentioned, Ben Smith, who at the time wasn't a big deal. He's become quite a big deal in the profession. But he was working in New York journalism, and he was one of our first recruits and probably our most important early recruit, because he was somebody who had just a natural, intuitive understanding of digital journalism and the speed that it required, the voice that it required. He really was our most important early hire. But anyway, I often have used this metaphor, but including at the time, but it felt like we were on a plane headed right for the mountain. We weren't prepared to launch within 2 months, and we missed the mountain by about 2 feet.
So at that point in time, if someone had asked you, John, who's our competition, what would you have said?
I've always then and now think of our competition in sort of a Venn diagram way. Really, the most important competition at the time, from a publishing point of view, was these Capitol Hill newspapers, the Hill, Roll Call, because they sustained a lot of advertising. Politico was an experiment in several respects. We were kind of innovators in publication building on the web, but we were not innovators in terms of how to identify a business model and attack it. There had been a longstanding sort of tradition in Washington of people who trying to sort of what we call advocacy advertising, people trying to influence a public agenda in some way, coming to Washington, spending money. They'd advertise in the Washington Post. They'd advertise and be sponsors of Meet the Press. And especially they would advertise heavily in the Capitol Hill newspapers. So I would say we really wanted to be first on Capitol Hill, and I think pretty quickly we did just kind of elbow our way in and establish ourselves as clearly operating at a higher tier than other competition. But in other ways, the 2008 presidential campaign already vigorously underway when we launched. there we're competing against the Washington Post, we're competing against the New York Times, we're competing against the Associated Press.
Are there moments along the way that really stick out to you in terms of significant events in the story of Politico? Not necessarily events that the publication covered, but events in the life of Politico that really stick out to you as significant in the story.
Well, the first year that we're discussing was such a roller coaster. We barely had a successful launch, but then we did, and we were pretty quickly getting noticed for our coverage. We were breaking some stories. We were having important interviews with presidential candidates and the like. So, all right, this is working a couple months in. And then we keep coming back to Ben Smith. Ben totally screwed up a story. We had the exclusive that John Edwards was about to drop out of the presidential campaign because his then wife, Elizabeth Edwards, was her cancer had returned. He's about to drop out. We had it first. Cable was citing us or whatever. It turned out not to be true. Or as I said to Ben, it turned out to be premature. Edwards did drop out about 10 months later. And we totally screwed it up. And everybody was gloating and hurling eggs at us. But we did what I think is what you should do in any context in journalism: be transparent about your error. We had the story explaining the error up on our site much longer than the story that had been an error was. So that was like a horrible down. Just 2 months into it, and then a couple months after that, we were sponsors of a presidential debate. We kind of elbowed our way into a Republican presidential debate. Well, so it's people who, I'm sure there's others on the call who've started businesses. You're always making stone soup at the beginning, right? You're faking it, and then all of a sudden, well, the people they're eating the soup. How about that? And it's a bit of fakery and a bit of substance. And over time, the substance and the reality is, when you dawn on it, like, hey, it dawns on you, hey, this is actually working. We had been bullshitting everybody, but now we're not. It's sort of satisfying.
Was there a moment when you said, oh my God, this is working? People are drinking the soup?
Interesting question.
Yeah. There were different moments along the way, but I mean, certainly one was when we, by year 3, we had a robustly profitable year. Made something like $10 million. And so that was like, okay, it's going to be hard to stop us now. I felt great fragility up until that time.
Did you, especially in those early years, but did you ever really think that Politico would be as transformative as it has turned out to be in terms of how national and increasingly more local, I guess, politics are covered in this country?
I don't really think that we were transformative. I do think we were very early to a trend that was that we didn't invent, but we tried to exploit. A new style of covering politics, in particular, with more immediacy. Recognizing that there's a lot of people who follow the stuff almost as if it's sports or entertainment. It's not. It's certainly not entertainment, especially not these days, where there's just issues of historic consequence at stake. The issues were large at that time too, where the Iraq War was still underway. Not long after our launch, we had the financial crash. So the issues were serious, but we recognized that there was an audience that craved the kind of immediacy that you typically didn't associate with what I earlier referred to as the old order. Then the nature of the old order was to speak with this kind of oracular distance. And we weren't into that. So we didn't invent that trend, but I guess we were an accelerant. And I knew we were onto something pretty early, but I didn't know everywhere that would take us. I didn't envision at the time that we would have, one of the largest news organizations in Europe. I didn't anticipate that we would have a significant footprint in the States and a growing footprint in the States.
So, an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. What do you see for Politico 15 years from now? What do you see for political journalism 15 years from now, or even 5 years from now? The changes that you think are coming that may be inevitable.
Well, it was not an unfair question. It's one that I think about and am paid to think about all the time. I do see, and I do hope for, in some sense, a swing of the pendulum. And you could say, well, of course, I'm just reflecting self-interest. When we were starting and leaving, starting Politico, leaving an established institution, I thought the trend of challenging institutional power and coming up with new models was not only did I think it was something that was happening, whether you wished for it or not, but I really thought it was on balance a good thing. And I do think on balance, the results have been good. Among the things it's done is it's a proliferation of outlets. There's far more now. In certain circles, you wouldn't say this is true in Duluth, Minnesota or Hartford, Connecticut, I don't think. But in Washington and some other major kind of power centers, including New York, actually journalism is fairly robust. The business model. So, and you wouldn't have said that at all 15 years ago. So I think the process of innovation, along with some kind of creative destruction, has been good. When I say I wish for the pendulum to swing back, I do think that I'm a believer in institutions. You and I know each other from the Carleton College Board. Well, that's one of the institutions that's important in my life. I think institutions are a place that cultivate values and cultivate people, and in a sense maintain and vindicate the standards within a profession or within a larger society. And the sort of rabid the pendulum that's moved so ferociously against institutions, I think it's got real limits. I love seeing reporters strike out on their own and make a lot more money compared to what they did 15 years ago. I think it's kind of cool when somebody can say the New York Times, to hell with you, I'm going to make more money on Substack, writing my own column or blog there, and a certain number of people will pay me for it. And I'm making $1 million at Substack, and you guys were only paying me 200. That's cool. But I don't think individual writers can perform the function of institutions, strong, robust institutions, of holding public officials accountable, of being able to stand up to intimidation from advertisers or from corporate or government officials. I don't think anybody but institutions can focus attention in a sustained way on important subjects. To me, that's one of the big hazards of modern life, is the sort of the shredding of memory. We tend to not even remember what we were indignant about the day before yesterday, because we're in such a barrage of news and such a kind of a nonstop frenzy. I think it's important to have focus, and I think strong news organizations as institutions, collections of people, rather than just individual actors doing their own thing, have a real role in that.
So your comments about institutions, I pulled this quote from your book, from Survivor. You wrote, "The defining fact of American public life over the past generations have been the erosion of power and confidence in most traditional institutions. That was, when did the book come out?
You actually pulled that, because I wrote something very similar to that in the other day. And
Yeah, you did.
I didn't realize to the extent to which I was repeating myself.
Well, and my point really is, it was true, and it seems to me to be continuing to be true, and that has impact on everything you do every day, which is, it involves the president, the Congress, and now more recently the Supreme Court, it seems to me, but also the media itself.
Yeah.
And as you think about the future, what concerns you about what may be, as part of this larger loss of credibility in institutions in general, how that impacts people and how they feel about the credibility and their faith in the media, whatever that means?
Yeah. Well, first off, you're right that this isn't a recent trend. It's really a 50-year trend. It's a half-century trend. The steady decline in sort of institutional respect, institutional affiliations, and institutional support. I'm just young enough. I don't really think of myself as a baby boomer. I guess technically I am. I was born in late 1963, but I feel like the real baby boomers have got 10 years on me, and probably year one. I think it's your fault, Steve, and your generation. I think of all the phenomenal things that baby boomers have done, I think that's one part of their legacy, is the of kind of 50-year cultural and ideological war that has left people less attached to institutions, has left institutions less worthy of support and respect. And I just think there's real hazards in that. I don't worry so much about the media, but I do think the future of free society depends on people having confidence that institutions work, and they'll have confidence in institutions working if they actually work. Since in many cases they aren't working properly, the loss of faith is well justified. But the consequences of that are also clear. We aren't working well to solve problems as a nation, or in my view, fully meeting our responsibilities to the world in an era in which the challenges, problems are increasingly are global in character, and so therefore the remedies must be global in character. It's I'm afraid I'm in a rather dark mood. I think, like many Americans.
One of the things that you talked about in the book that again seems to me to have relevance to our world today is, you quoted George Santayana. I love this quote, which was, fanaticism consists of redoubling your effort when you've forgotten your aim. And
that's a famous quote.
Yeah, and it just, I'd love to hear you talk about that, which you wrote years and years ago in the context of the reaction of some Republicans to the whole Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal and the impeachment. But it seems to me that that quote has a lot of relevance to what we're seeing in our society today. And I'd love to just get your reaction to that.
Well, you're right. That was the context. I was using it within the impeachment, when the Republicans kept going after Clinton, even after it became clear that the public didn't support them. But I think what was happening, we can now see with benefit of hindsight in the Clinton era, the emergence of Gingrich, Tom DeLay, Fox News, starting in Bill Clinton's second term, was a brand of politics that was driven by different incentives. The old incentives did tend to push people toward a center and toward solving a problem. The new incentives in politics, I think, tend to push people to the ideological extremes, the rhetorical extremes, the personal extremes. As people follow those incentives, there's a kind of an industry to be made on it, right? There's especially a kind of a contempt industry, right? Like there's whole business models on publishing, cable news, political fundraising that are, I think, based in kind of commercialized contempt that you can draw an audience, you can monetize that audience, you can gain loyalties by finding new ways of kind of tapping into people's sense of suspicion and grievance. So I think that's what's new. Ideological division, cultural division is nothing new in American history. Many times it's been more violent than we have now. Even in your lifetime or my lifetime, I was a child, but you had college campuses that were being held hostage, or people blowing up math departments, or riots in the big cities. Well, that's not new. It was happened in the 30s. It happened. Of course, we had a civil war in the 1860s. So we don't have anything like that now. So like the fact of our divisions, I don't think are new. What I do think is new is the degree to which there is an industry of commercialized contempt, and the media is a big part of it. And I think social media is a big part of it. It uses modern technology to unleash something rather primitive in probably all human nature, the instinct to take sides, to feel that to be tribal, to at some level to kill or be killed. Fortunately not literally true most of the time, but if you look at a lot of the way politics is discussed these days, it does reflect a kill or be killed mentality.
So you've written recently a couple of pieces at least about, and where you've talked about progressive centrism. And you had a great piece, I thought, about Tony Blair being on Bill Clinton's podcast. Mm-hmm. I'd love just to hear your thoughts on this notion of progressive centrism, or whatever you want to call it. And is there a place for that today? And are there certain impediments, which you've also written about recently, to, for lack of a better term, a comeback of centrism in this country?
Yeah. I don't. You said that maybe Al Fromm would be joining us. I don't know if he is, but if so, I'm going to be talking about themes that he devoted his professional life to. Much of my coverage has been of people who I do think represented a kind of a robust brand of progressive centrism. That's how I view Bill Clinton. That's how I view Tony Blair. And that's in my native state of Virginia, where I got my reporting. I'm from New York, but as a young reporter, I worked in Virginia. The most successful politicians there were people who were especially successful and especially creative in kind of finding a center. And in doing that, they flipped a state that used to be very conservative now as a much more progressive state. It's not in fashion, right? My kids read that column that you liked, and they more than rolled their eyes. They were angry at it and angry at me. It was like, look, that brand of politics, it just doesn't work. It's let us down. It's not bringing about solutions. It's not reflecting the urgency that we feel. I don't believe that the brand of politics that Bill Clinton represented in the 1990s is the appropriate brand of politics that or the specific policies that would be successful in in the 2020s. But I do believe I just don't see a very effective, any kind of credible alternative other than the Progressive Party defining a vital center, not necessarily middle of the road. That's Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, said that's the dead center. The vital center is one that's very attuned to solving problems and recognizes like that in this country, especially a large and diverse country, like just cleaving to a particular ideological wing, if it worked, so fine, give it a try. But I just haven't seen anyone get elected and then have a sustainable, durable governing majority with it. And so I really don't see an alternative other than somebody not channeling Bill Clinton's personality or specific policies, but channeling that spirit of how do you find a how do you create an effective governing majority for some progressive policies. It's easier for the Conservative Party in a way because they're more about stopping things. It's much harder for a progressive party. I've never seen a good model that says other than really finding a kind of robust creative center. You look at, again, I'm speaking to you from our Politico's offices are in just over the river from Georgetown in Virginia, and it's where I live. People say, oh, it's now a Democratic state. Well, here Al Fromm is on. We find out if he agrees or disagrees. But Virginia's now a Democratic state. Well, like bullshit. Actually, it's not, if you don't have the politics right. We got a Republican governor, attorney general, lieutenant governor just got elected in a sweep. So if somebody can tell me like the non-centrist way to win Virginia, like I'm all ears.
So shifting gears a little bit, but I think it's a good, you just gave me a good segue. In your book, you said that in 1992, when Clinton ran against George H.W. Bush, the Democratic Party lacked a presidential election strategy. Do you think that's true today for the Democratic Party? And same question for the Republican Party. Do they have a presidential election strategy as a party?
Well, what I meant in the at the time I was referring to then in the 90s was that the Democrats felt very secure with their congressional majorities. We would later find out that they weren't anywhere near as secure as they thought. Lost those majorities in 1994, but at the time they'd had them for 40 years. But the party that had been effective at the legislative level by playing sort of coalition politics, special interest politics, and kind of clinging to the old verities, just wasn't attractive at the presidential level where you really need a national vision. So they had lost in 1980, lost in 84, lost in 88. So no, that's what I meant. They did not have a presidential strategy. And Bill Clinton changed that by becoming competitive in states that had been off the field in 88, and especially in 1984 when Vice President Mondale lost so big. Do Democrats have and Republicans have a presidential election strategy now? I would say that it's very precarious on the Democratic side, just because there's so many states where they just can't compete, and for the near term can't compete. And so that means that there's much less room for error in the states that they should win. Hillary Clinton obviously is the example of that, when she lost those states in the upper Midwest, like when she lost the presidency. they couldn't conceive that was about to happen, but it was really a failure of imagination. Republicans, I would say, I really question their sort of presidential election strategy long term. What's surprised me is how effective it's been short term to run on kind of grievance politics, tapping into. I don't mean to say it's entirely reactionary, but it's heavily reactionary of people who just don't like the thrust of modern life, and they feel like the East and West Coast establishments and elites are looking down their nose at them, and they're angry about it, and they want to go back to a different time. That there's enormous votes, there's enormous power in that. Donald Trump stimulated, turnout for his coalition that Mitt Romney could not pull out. And even in losing, after all the what I would see as embarrassments of the first term, that he would grow his popular vote by 12 million. Anyway, no Republicans but seeking advice. No Democrat either, seeking advice from me on like the presidential election strategies. They've had one that works. I simply don't see how it works long term if they can't attract younger voters, which have been overwhelmingly Democratic in recent elections. And they've had some success, to give credit, with breaking down the Democratic lock on minority voters, African Americans and Hispanics especially. You've seen some erosion, but in a younger, more diverse society, no party is going to be successful unless it can be credible with younger, more diverse voters. I actually thought, though, it was a good trend, to be honest, that Republicans cut into the minority vote. I don't think it's a healthy society that just sees people as groups and blocks that automatically go for one party or the other. I think it makes the competition is healthy, and it also is a factor that can mitigate against what we've been talking about. The tendency toward the ideological, cultural, and partisan extremes can bring us back to a center if parties have to really compete for the Hispanic vote, really compete for the African American vote.
Great. John, unbelievably, we're out of time. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation, and congratulations on 15 years, Politico. And
thank you.
Thank you for everything you do. And I'll see you in Northfield, Minnesota.
I look forward to it. And as far as Politico, we worked awfully hard and had fun doing it most of the time. So that's quite a nice combo. And there's 1,000 of us that work here now, and we're rather proud of what we built.
Just one last question. When you launched, how many employees did you have?
About 50.
And now you're 1,000.
Yeah.
It's not bad growth.
Sure. So it's who knows what we'll be in 15 years from now. I guess that's 2037.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, John.
Alex, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Steve. And just to echo Steve, John, thank you so much for being here. I did promise that I would ask one question for somebody. So if you got one more, your hot take on Joe Manchin.
Oh, it's a 50-50 Senate. I mean, he's frustrating because I think he's not being totally clear. He's indicating he's kind of open to deal, and then when it comes time to actually close the deal, he's not been there. And so I don't blame colleagues in the Senate for being frustrated or even angry with him. I would say, look, have a little bit of detachment just from Democratic progressives who are so angry. Like, what state do they think he represents, or if he does vote as you would wish in a way that's apparently not what he actually feels, and isn't how he presented himself to West Virginia voters. Or would you think the alternative to Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema is going to be more likely to pass the agenda you want? There's just no substitute for winning, not just a bare majority, but a robust majority. And that means going into states that Democrats used to win and haven't been competitive for the last 20 years, and winning them again. Al Fromm is on here. He texted me, and he knows Indiana politics well. Well, look, all right, let's get some Democratic senators from Indiana, or old enough to remember the days. George McGovern in South Dakota, Frank Church in Idaho. We're a long way from that, but I just think progressives are going to be frustrated until they have a more robust Senate majority. And 6 months from now, they be happy to have a majority at all. It's not likely that they will, but you're just not going to see a big progressive agenda until you somehow solve this problem of expanding the Democratic footprint.
I appreciate you answering that. And John, once again, thank you so much for being here. Steve, as always, thank you for what you do for us. We're greatly appreciative. And to Dan Woog for his great introduction and for always being such a good partner to the library. Thank you all. And for everyone watching at home, thank you so much for joining us. And you can look for this up on our YouTube in a couple days. Everybody, good night, stay safe, and thank you all.
Sure enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.